talk about legal protection and documenting cemeteries, and they really are sort of tied together, because you'll see when you're talking about cemeteries and the process of burying somebody and creating a special land use for cemeteries. I'm going to talk first in the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711 through 715. 16 is really the main sections that have to do with the laws. And so I put the definition in the Health and Safety Code. I'm going to preface a little of this because actually things do change over time in the state government, and right now we have a House Bill 2927, that the Texas Historical Commission has done some research, and we're trying to add and modify some information in the law to help us better preserve cemeteries. And this was the result. This is Donna Howard's sponsored the bill. This is the result of the Texas Ranger Museum in Waco. I don't know if any of you, have you been reading about that? It was built in the 1960s, the museum was, and it's very interesting. I can go on and on about so-called cemeteries moved and how they haven't been moved and why were all the graves moved and this kind of thing. But anyway, the museum was built in 1968, where the First Avenue Cemetery is located, but it was certified by a district judge that all the graves had been moved. However, this last year they were adding an addition to it and ran into dozens of graves while they were putting the utility line in. And suddenly started looking, the archaeologists were brought in and found out that not all the graves were moved. And there's many issues about were hundreds supposed to be moved? Did they only move the marked ones but not the unmarked ones? And it's a very complicated thing. So Donna Howard had a hearing last fall, and she had many people come in and testify, and she wanted to find ways to eliminate this from happening in the future. So there's a lot of issues that we've sort of been trying to address and put in the legislation. One of them is it is really directly related to, we've added that indicates that one grave is a cemetery. And that may sound kind of silly, but I've had a lot of arguments on the phone with people who decided that one grave was not a cemetery and therefore didn't have to follow all the rules. I don't know why, but anyway. So, and then the other section I put in for definition was that previously they only talked about the fence and the monument, or the tombstone, whatever you want to call it, and nothing else in the cemetery. And so technically, I guess if somebody did some vandalism of something else, which would include landscaping, the roads, the paths, curbing, walls, benches, or things like that, maybe it wouldn't be considered part of the cemetery. So we're putting that in the law. The House bill did pass out of the House yesterday, and it's been moved to the Senate. So we're hoping that we'll get through the process before we run out of time at the end of May. The next series of statements are either in the law or in the legal case law. And it's really, we have this problem all the time because people say, well, it's just a small little cemetery and there's just a few broken headstones, and it really isn't a cemetery. Yes, it is a cemetery. So there is some case law having to do with that. And it really doesn't have to be separate from another piece of property, though we'll be talking about issues of boundaries, but it doesn't have to be. And, people think that you've got to officially declare that is a cemetery and get it recorded in deed records. Obviously, that's an important thing to do, but the act of burying somebody in the ground, that land can only be used for cemetery purposes. So you have a question where somebody decides to maybe encroach or actually physically build something on top of the cemetery. There may be no markers, but there's still a cemetery there. There still remains. You can't do that. Or at least you're we're breaking the law. This is one that we constantly are trying to explain to people. They buy a piece of property and there's a cemetery on it, and they say, well, I bought the cemetery. And they go, no, you can't own a cemetery in Texas, technically. So it's held in trust to the people that are buried there, and the people are eligible to be interred there. So the only two things in the law, all these sections really, a lot of it addresses perpetual care cemeteries and not the sort of family cemetery that we think about, or maybe a community cemetery or something that's kind of extended from a family cemetery. But so the only two things in the legislation right now says that you must provide access to the cemetery so people can visit it, and that you must not desecrate the cemetery. Beyond that, it doesn't really address anything else. Can the surrounding landowners stop a family member from burying somebody in that cemetery? It isn't addressed in the law at all. It isn't addressed in the law at all. As I said, most of the cemetery laws are in these sections, and then there's a breakout on the section of the Health and Safety Code. I think I've already said that, but you, under 711.035F, once the cemeteries, you have a cemetery, it can only be used for cemetery purposes, unless you go to district court and remove the remains and also remove the dedication. So if you do move a cemetery, then it must be moved into a perpetual care cemetery, and like I said, the dedication is removed by district court. We've had cases where people they just went up and dug them up out of a farm and took them to another cemetery, but it really is against the law. 2 sessions ago, we had the law changed that the Texas Historical Commission, as well as the County Historical Commission, are contacted about this. This really is a lawsuit, and they are both members are contacted. They are parties to the suit if they want to be, so that we can go to court and agree or disagree about this proposed action. Obviously, we try to leave the remains where they are, because then you're going to move it out of context and what. Certainly there must be some relationship to the ground, to the individual or family members that are buried there. So obviously we try to find a way that they can be left in place, maybe as an open space requirement within some kind of development or something. Obviously we don't try to have it as a fenced-in area in the middle of the parking lot in there. You may have seen examples of that. We get calls and people feel that we're supposed to just go out and arrest somebody because they've broken the state cemetery laws, and that's not the case. It really is your sheriff or your municipal police department. And I kind of reminded them last year, I wrote an article in their magazine and told them their responsibilities last year. So I hope that they did read it. But we thought it would be good to get it out there. Obviously, they're busy with a lot of things, but that is one of their duties. So we want them to be aware. There's really 3 state agencies that are involved in cemeteries. Obviously, the Texas Historical Commission to protect and preserve. The Banking Commission, they really oversee all the perpetual care and for-profit cemeteries in the state. And I think the number is around 254, something like that. And the Funeral Service Commission is the other state agency that is involved. And I'll be talking a little more about them having to do with access a little bit later. Under desecration, there's the section under the penal code. Before, I think it was the last session, it was only a misdemeanor. And we put in several things into the law, proposed to put changes in the law. And it got to the committee that the chairman has been very much involved with jail overcrowding, and said that he wasn't going to have any more state jail felony matters added to the law. However, this was already in there, actually it was in 2 sections, very confusing kind of thing. So there was a resolution that it would be taken out of another section, and this was the section. So it does say here, human burials. And the DA last Saturday, up near Granbury, we had a workshop. Her interpretation is that generally the state jail felony is from $1,500 to $20,000, at least at this one level. However, her interpretation is that from $1 to $1,500, it only pertains to human burials, that you can't have a felony on it. So she's basically saying you don't have to have almost no damage, and it suddenly can be bumped up to a state jail felony. So she is working on one right now that's a hate crime as well as a desecration, and she couldn't really talk about it because it's still in court, but that's her interpretation of this section. And surprisingly, there's been some horrible experiences with people being dug up and used to try to give the impression that they were burned up in a car accident and some other horrible things. And I thought that by now that the law would have been changed to a felony, but it's still a misdemeanor. However, the last law would pertain to damaging a human burial, so that really, it is a felony then if you use that other section. This is a section that, let me see, this is the one about improvement. So obviously if you're starting to do some work and you find a cemetery, you're supposed to stop and you have to go through a process of removing the remains and the dedication. We do have 50,000 cemeteries in the state. So there may be cases where there's very few markers or none at all, or the interpretation. So it's a possibility that somebody could legitimately run into a cemetery and not know that there was one there. This is an interesting section which I don't think anybody even knows that it exists. It was passed, I think about 6-8 years ago, and I wasn't really involved with it, so I don't know what the reason was, the initial reason. If you find a cemetery, you're supposed to record it in the deed records. The county clerk's not supposed to charge anything. And you're supposed to have a legal description of the land. And the county clerks called me when it was first passed and said, well, where's the form, or who's going to come up with a form, or how do we do it? And at that point, there wasn't any state agency that was responsible to write rules. You have state agencies can write rules on sections. And I told the clerk that we didn't have the authority to write rules, so that's basically it. So this pending bill we put in here to sort of tighten it up. If you do find an unknown cemetery, you're supposed to record it. You're supposed to index it to the surrounding landowner, because if you just record it without indexing it to a piece of land, it's just floating in there in the deed records. Nobody's ever going to find it when they do a title search or anything like that. So we're adding that in, and then we're also adding it that we're supposed to get a copy of it, because we don't even know how many have been filed anyway. So we're doing that. And we're under another section, the Texas Historical Commission is going to have the authority to write rules under 711.011. So my feeling is I'd like to get some more information out to the public about this section if they do find it. And I do get calls where somebody's going to the woods and stumbles into one or two graves, and they're not on the maps or anywhere. It's still amazing. With 50,000 cemeteries, we just use that as a general number. They're out there, and people probably know where some are. Even cemetery gatherings, we'll go lunch after or something, or dinner, and suddenly there's this generating of information, and have you seen that grave that was down on somebody's fence line, and I haven't been out there in 20 years, I wonder if it's still there. It's just fascinating, the amount of information that's out there that's not, not on the maps or not recorded anywhere. So I'm hoping that we can generate some information to the public so that they can take this opportunity to provide us with some more information. This is one I get calls all the time on, 711.041, about access to a cemetery. You're supposed to be given access to any cemetery that's not on the right of way, and just supposed to be indicated on the direction or the path to take to visit the cemetery. Our involvement with this section, about 6 years ago, we got a call from Hardin County, which is just north of Beaumont, and a family member visited, went through the process, contacted the surrounding landowner, got permission and directions on how to visit the cemetery. It was located on about 5 or 6 acres. The landowner was not using the land. The cemetery was about 6 graves. And she visited the cemetery and noticed that a dead pine tree had fallen, but it didn't hit the stones, it was between them. So she came back a couple of days later to cut that up and remove it, and the landowner, which we don't understand why, called the sheriff and had her removed. So she decided to go to court. And I'll be kind of explaining what's happened on the rules since then, but it's generally about a $15,000 process to go to court. The County Historical Commission from Hardin County called us and said, "Could you help?" And we have a legal representative at the Attorney General's office, and that's Joe Thrash, and I could probably use him full time, but he's also responsible for the rest of our agency and about 6 other agencies too. But he really looked at it and said, "Well, this looks like a good, clean case. Let's become interveners into this case." So we jumped in. We had to go down to the court to have a hearing with the judge to get permission to get on the property, which he agreed. Then we had to come back down again to record it and really look at it. And then the court case, it was a 3-day court case with a jury trial, which is really amazing. And of course, I was up there being drilled about a lot of things, but we won the case. And what was good was they appealed so that we got a written opinion, and it went to San Antonio Appeal Court, and we got a written opinion that she did have rights to visit the cemetery, to do cleaning, to add plants or things like that, or do enhancement to it. The only thing that the jury said no on was put a fence around it, which we just don't know. Maybe it's the way we wrote the question. I don't know. But anyway, you never know if you're having a win or lose on the thing. But we did create some case law. So as I said before, the state agencies, different ones have different rule authority. Well, the Funeral Service Commission had the rule authority over this section of the law. So they had some public hearings last year around the state and listened to a lot of testimony with people that have not been able to visit cemeteries. In some cases, 10 to 15 years have been trying to get into the cemetery. So they had meetings, and their commissioners decided that they would do a process of sending out a certified letter, and if the owner responded, then they could go to arbitration and try to come up with a solution. If that didn't work, then they have quarterly meetings in Austin, and they would indicate to the surrounding landowner that he or she should attend and to have a formal hearing about this issue. Now, if you said no to the law before, then there was no financial penalty. And with the Funeral Service Commission, they haven't had any cases yet, because this thing was only 2 or 3 months ago that they finished the rule processing in the Texas Register, going through the process. But even if they say yes, there is no penalty. However, There's two bills in the legislature right now. Representative Coleman has one in, and then our bill in there includes injunction of any of the cemetery laws sections. So we're just going to see. I think that one of the two will pass, and will be interesting to see how many cases, because I think once it gets out to the public, I kind of predict that they'll probably be having a hearing every time they meet every quarter, because there's a lot of these issues around there. This is an interesting section of the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 715. It's like a conservatorship, like a guardianship program, that you have a cemetery. This was actually, the idea came up with a group in Houston that were trying to maintain some urban cemeteries, historic cemeteries, that it really had no cemetery association anymore, and was basically cutting the grass. And of course, in Houston, Harris County, you can cut the grass and cut the vegetation and come back a few months later and do like you've done anything. So they were constantly doing that, and they really had no control over the cemetery. So this bill was passed so that you could go to court with a petition and a written plan, which the Texas Historical Commission reviews, and set up a nonprofit corporation and have some financial at least set up on what you're going to do and some kind of long-term goals. We have reviewed, I think, 6 cases, and I think in the last 10 years. And it's fairly, we review the written plan, and if anybody's interested, obviously we'll sit down and, we're not just waiting for the plan to appear and either, reject it or approve it. We'll work with the group. I've gone to the cemetery. I've helped them figure out what should be done and how it should properly be done, that kind of thing. But last year we had an interesting case where 2 organizations wanted the cemetery, where we're pleading for somebody to get. So it was a court case for 3 days, and it had, 8 or 10 attorneys, 4 or 5 from each side, and it was just a full-blown case. So it was very interesting to sit there and hear the process go through, and one group was selected. So that was a very unusual case, and I'm not sure if we'll ever have that again, but it was a very interesting experience to go through. Obviously, I just threw this in because obviously we're interested in historic cemeteries, but we get calls, and there seems to be an interest now in creating a family cemetery on your property. And I get a call about once a month on what should you do. So, I'll just quickly go through. It's basically has to do with distance from the city limits of your city. And the other thing is to create a plot map and record it with the county clerk, so that there's some kind of record of it. Again, we're trying to, and then also I suggest the public right-of-way into the cemetery, thinking about some of the 19th century examples of somebody setting up a family cemetery, thinking they're going to own that land forever, and then, they die and somebody else inherits it, and they don't want to deal with the land, and they sell it outside the family, and, a lot of people respect it, but then there are others that say, no, I don't want you on this property, and, I'm not going to give you access. So, obviously, if you're going to create a new cemetery, let's not create a problem down the line. So, and then also record keeping. Again, people call me and they want to know, they want a plot map for a particular cemetery in the state, and it doesn't exist in, 98% of the time. They want a contact person for the cemetery association. Well, we don't have it, and maybe there's not even a cemetery association, in which case there isn't. So people just don't understand that there isn't this system of all this information that's just there, and you just pluck it out and send it to them. So I'm going to shift now into documentation. We really think it's a very important part of the process of preserving the cemetery. And these are the 2 programs. We do have another one, RIP Guardian, that has to do with like an adopt the cemetery. I'm not going to talk about that today, but these are the two programs that really have to do with survey and recording. And we, you know, the rest in peace, RIP, we sort of played to that and come up with record, investigate, and protect. The statewide survey I'll talk about first. I have a map that I handed out, and then I'll talk about the designation program. And I handed out the map because sometimes people really can't see which counties are field and archival. We were lucky we got a TxDOT grant in 2001 to 2005 to do survey of cemeteries. And we really had never done anything that extensive. And so I, you know, tried to figure out, could we visit 3 cemeteries a day, and you know, this kind of not really certain and how much information we had, you know. And so what it finally ended up to be that we did do work on 107 of them, but we really only went out to 49 and actually physically got some information. In other words, we got GPS, we got digital pictures, and we filled out a survey form very similar to the designation. And we put it on some map, and then we came back, we put it on our atlas. The archival counties, the rest of them, we did archival work in the office, and we weren't able to, for time and money, get out to visit those. And we did, in the field work, we did the archival work too, please, because if you've ever been, you know, you think you know where that cemetery is, and you keep driving back and forth down the road, and you can't find it. You stop and ask people, and they live a quarter-mile away, and they don't even know about the cemetery. It's just amazing sometimes. So we tried to eliminate that as much as possible, but there was still a lot of that going on. We had 3 surveyors out in the field, historians out in the field collecting data, and one stayed on the whole 3 years, and that was a grueling thing to do. That might sound like a cool thing to do, but you get into summer, and I'm telling you, it's really tough to be out there, you know, every day for, you know, some of them worked 6 days a week and then took off 2 days. But we have a lot of data, and we certainly can, you know, provide that information to you if you're interested. And we found out that 37% of those cemeteries are at risk, so that number was really higher than we thought. And what we did was, when we did the survey, was to come up with sort of endangerment levels, so that when we got through, we went back to the counties that we'd surveyed and gave them a list, asked them to look at it, see if there was any corrections and things. But we also gave them at least our impression of what level of endangerment that we felt the cemetery had. Now, if you're dealing with 200, 250 cemeteries in the county, you really have to set up some kind of way to address the most endangered ones, because the number is just mind-boggling. You know, we had the opportunity to visit them all, say within a month and a half. And if you're just going Saturdays, if you're working and trying to visit all 250, it takes a long time to get out there, and you know, and try to, if you got access problems and that kind of thing. So we had a great opportunity to look at those in a fairly short period of time. And I put up here some of the factors that we considered that would affect endangerment. Obviously, inadequate fencing, encroachment by development. We really looked outside the cemetery, not just inside the cemetery, to see if it was being maintained, because, you know, the impact outside, maybe there's a quarry, maybe they're developing the land for a subdivision, you know, whatever. Erosion, we've had several along the creeks, and we wanted to, and we've actually lost some of the graves, and sadly, on some of these cemeteries, so we wanted to be aware of that. And, you know, changes, like I said, in surrounding land, changes in the use, restricted access. Obviously, if you can't visit it, you don't know what's happening there. So that's, we figured that was vandalism. That's something that's still going on very all over the state, and I keep hearing more and more about it in different ways. The newest thing in Austin County, somebody's gone out and carefully chiseled all the porcelain pictures off the headstones. Now, if there were new ones, they left those alone. They were only doing the old ones. I can only imagine maybe they're going to try to sell those in an antique dealer. I don't know what. This is something I'd never seen before. So, and even the directional sign. And now some people might think that, you know, if you tell somebody what a cemetery is, they're going to go vandalize it. I don't think so. We really don't see any direct relationship to that. It's you know, helps them visit the cemetery. It also just gets the name out there. You know, I think it's great when I'm driving down the road and I see the Jones Cemetery Road, and I think that's great because it puts in people's mind Jones Cemetery, and they'll sort of know where it is. And you know, I think it's important to get it out in the public eye about where that cemetery is and what it's called and that kind of thing. Obviously, broken and missing grave markers, you know, is certainly negative, you know, and it relates to other activities. Isolated, obviously, you could have vandalism and all kinds of things happening. Visitation, obviously, if somebody's visiting several times a year, that's really not what we call. We're talking about that there's just nobody. You know, I've been to some sites and talked to some landowners, and the very isolated sites, and told me that I had been the first person in 40 years that had ever asked them where it was and went visit it. So, I mean, there aren't lots of sites out there like that. Informational sign at the entrance. You'd think that that's not important, but we think it's important to give the name and also a contact person so that you can contact somebody if you have something you wanted to know about the cemetery, or you were going to talk to them about maybe a future burial or something like that. And then obviously we have problems with dumping grounds, that people just think that they can throw their mattresses and old tires and everything on this quote abandoned cemetery. It won't make any difference. So we really are a race against time, and we feel these endangered cemeteries that in 10 years they're probably going to be gone. You know, and I've talked about some of these factors, but just bring it up again. Certainly vandalism, just natural growth. Because you have all this growth, especially if we're not in a drought, that moisture is held near the stones. You know, they do deteriorate. They're not going to be around forever. Certainly if there's any wood elements or something like that, that certainly accelerates deterioration. And we certainly have encroachment. You know, when I see something like that, I wonder how many other unmarked graves are sitting in somebody's backyard and only that fence is surrounding the ones that can be seen. So we don't really know. Neglect, this is kind of interesting. I was in Kent County, which is a little north of Abilene, and we've done a program. About 70 counties out in West Texas had never applied for the designation. So I've been working with them to get their first designation. And I went out to Claremont, which was out in that area. There's two counties where the cemetery is the only thing left, and you can still see the courthouse and the jail. And the town is totally moved away, and those are the three elements that are there. This one you can see the jail and the first floor of the courthouse. The second floor was torn out. And this gentleman took me out there. He's the county sheriff. He's an ex-county judge and ex-county commissioner. So he's been there all his life. He's about 80. And I was helping him do some photographing and stuff, and he was looking at all the stones, and I'm sure he knew everybody that's buried there. And when I was almost through, he said, well, come on up here. I'm going to tell you a little story about the first sheriff that was in this county. And he said that sheriff went to Abilene to get the payroll and was murdered on the way home. And I guess it got dark and he hadn't come back, so a group went out and found him. And they decided they'd bring him back. Of course, this was the cemetery in the county, and so they dug a hole and, you know, obviously they had, you know, lanterns or something like that. Buried him. The next morning, brought his wife over, and they were horrified. Not that somebody dug it up, but they realized they had buried him at an angle, at 45 degrees to everybody else in the cemetery. And of course, I guess in the dark, he didn't in it. And they said, "Oh my gosh, we'll dig him up. We're sorry." And the wife said, "No, leave him alone." And so when she died about 15 years later, she's buried at an angle too. Well, when he's telling me this story, and it's a very interesting story, but there were some of these loose stones, and I just leaned over and turned them over, and I was able to put them together. And unfortunately, we don't have the individual, but he looked at it and said, "Oh, this is the oldest marked grave in the cemetery." So it was like, wow, but it's great we found it, but it's sad that, this continued deterioration and loss of information, because I'm not certain if that's really where the grave is, or just, just been sitting there anyway. So, and we have natural deterioration. Even granite, a half-inch carved letter in granite lasts about 800 years. That's a long time, but that's still, there is a time. And if you look at polished granite sometimes at an angle, you can see that it's starting to dull, and that's just starting the deterioration process. We're talking about real estate. It's just so important to get that location. And we were talking before the meeting about the GPS and things. And this was a legitimate, they did some survey in 1932. And, looking back, and even some of the descriptions more recent, I'm not sure, if you could even get there, because we don't know what road it's on. Maybe there's only one road 8 miles from Sherman. We don't know, is it marked graves? Are they near the road, or were they out in the field and now that field's been abandoned and it's all overgrown? There's so many factors that it would be very difficult to go back to this site. Again, of course, we don't know the Jones Farm either, which is fairly common description talking about some of these land and not trying to locate it by some other means. And of course, today we've got better equipment and processes. The USGS maps are certainly a good source. And they do have some cemeteries, they don't have them all, but certainly it's something to if you find a cemetery, you can mark it on there. You can actually even ask them to add that information to their maps. But the GPS is really the way to go now, because you can get back to that site again and within just a few feet with equipment that's fairly inexpensive. Some of the equipment that we used in the survey in 2002, 2003, last year it just died on me. I was using it after, and I was amazed when I went down to buy a new unit that cost less and was more accurate than the original. So I said, that's great. So that's really important. And just word of mouth, getting that information out that you're trying to find these cemeteries. In Waco, they put an announcement in the utility newsletter and got, I think they found over 100 cemeteries that were never listed before. So, and in some cases they had names of cemeteries but didn't know where they were, which is, I've heard of people telling me that before. So. Just really get that information out, because like I said, there's a lot of people out there that have that information, they just didn't know anybody is interested in it. The next few minutes, I'm just going to talk about the designation program, the Historic Texas Cemetery Designation Program. It's been in effect for 11 years now, and we've designated 1,200 cemeteries. Corey sort of give you some background. I started the commission in 1983 and 1986. I was doing one of these workshops and was asked to talk about cemeteries along with a couple of people that talked about National Register and our marker program. And when I agreed to it, I didn't realize I was going to become sort of the unofficial point person for cemetery questions. And over the next few years, I kept getting these phone calls and letters, and they said, what can we do about the cemetery? It's being cultivated closer and closer to the headstones every year, and the area's being divided up into subdivision or ranchettes or whatever you call it. And just talking to people within and outside the commission, they really felt we had to get the cemeteries into deed records because we don't have county zoning. So I went through the hurdles of starting a new program in the commission. And in 1997, the program was ready, but no funding. And one of our commissioners, Shirley Caldwell, was very interested in cemeteries, and she kept pushing and pushing, and eventually 2 positions got funded. Myself, the one I took, and then I have an assistant to help get the program going. So the reason that we have the program is really two. One of them is to record it in the deed records to alert the present and future landowners of the cemetery there, to try to establish boundaries as much as possible so that we're not, you as well as the commission is not getting a panic phone call about a bulldozer and it seems to be running into the cemetery and they don't seem to know there's a cemetery there and all those issues, and we really want to record them and get them in the deed records before. And also official recognition from the Texas Historical Commission, and there is an optional marker, several different kinds of markers you can get. But when I created the program, I was really trying to record the cemetery and not to impose financial burden on buying a marker. In some cases, these cemeteries, two people might see the marker every year because it's so isolated. So it doesn't really make any sense to spend that money on that. And anybody can apply. You don't have to have a relative buried there. You don't have to get permission from the Cemetery Association or anybody. There is already those laws that I talked about. We're just trying to publicly notify that there is human burials there and that it is a cemetery. So we're not, and of course the surrounding landowner doesn't own the cemetery, so they're just trustees. So we don't think that we're imposing any restrictions on that surrounding landowner or the Cemetery Association. We have no review authority over any changes to the cemetery once it's designated. That's certainly something people kind of don't understand or assume that we have some review authority. We're certainly there to provide free advice on cemetery conservation issues, but it's not a requirement. And the criteria are very simple because we don't want to say, well, one family cemetery is more important than this family cemetery. They're both important. So we really have a 50-year-old and deemed worthy of preservation. So if it's been there more than 50 years, and most of the cemeteries are 100 years old, people there that are buried there they've contributed to the community in some way. So very, very few are ever not accepted. The designation process, we have an application, and you did pick up the packet here, and when we go out to the cemetery, we'll go through the form. The information is collected and then sent to the County Historical Commission for their approval, and it varies from county to county. If the chair just reviews it and signs it, or it comes up to the whole county commission to review, or a cemetery committee within the commission reviews it. So it's really up to the county to decide which way. We think that they need to know what's happening, and also their expertise at the county level is certainly more than ours because we have 254 counties, so we certainly can't know about everything. So then it's sent to us for our review. If it's complete, then we notify the surrounding landowner about the application, not for approval, but just to let them know. And it's probably better to talk to them first because they sometimes get a certified letter from us, and they really getting a certified letter from the state agency. Sometimes they get a little upset and call me up, and I explain that it's really not going to impact their surrounding land, and they do have some responsibilities as trustees. So it's better to kind of let them know if this is going to happen and that there really isn't going to be impact on their surrounding land. Then we give them 2 weeks to comment on it, and in a few cases we send them the map that's recorded. In a few cases there's some corrections, and so that's fine. We're glad to make those corrections because we want the map to be as accurate as possible. And then we send the applicant the affidavit, which is just one page saying that it meets our criteria, and then Exhibit A is a map of the cemetery. So I do need to have as much information as possible, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then once we receive a receipt on the recorded affidavit, then it is designated. We don't need a certified copy, just a copy that shows the volume and page, or in some cases the counties have a document And like I said, here's the application, and we'll be talking about it at the cemetery. It's 4 pages long. It's basically sort of fill in the blank, and we're really asking for the minimum amount of information that we feel we need. This is really just a start. We don't require a photograph of every headstone. We only require a paragraph history about the cemetery. If you're going to get a marker, then we do need a footnoted history, probably several pages long. But at this point, we're just trying to get some general information about the cemetery. And the attachment, like I said, the narrative history I'll talk about. We want black and white photographs. You know, we're in this sort of transition of technology. And if I look in the old file, sometimes I even find Polaroids, which of course have pretty limited life. Even though I wish the cemetery you're working on, that somebody had photographed it in the 1950s, we're photographing and recording it now. So at least we're recording it in 20 years, that will be historic. So we want these photographs to be around for a while. And then a map we'll talk about the cemetery. There's just a standard narrative history sort of sample that we, I think this is the one we created. Yes, we created the 255th county and created all these histories on cemeteries and the creation of the county and the courthouse and all the kind of stuff. The historians, they had a great time. But anyway, so we just need basically information on, as far as you know, how it got started and what was the development over time, and just some information. And a lot of times there isn't a lot of written information about it. It's pretty much all history. And like I said, we want black and white photographs. Digital are great, but they're not going to end up on our CDs. They're not going to last. And unless we put it in our server, future software may not be able to read it and open it up. So we just really have an issue with that. And what we like is just to put a sticky note on the back with the numbers, and then relate those numbers to a site map to show where somebody was standing, and then a description of each photograph. Because we're looking at down the line, and we've had some 30 or 40-year-old photographs, and not obviously a cemetery where there's 3 or 4 graves, but hundreds, and really having a difficult time trying to figure out where that photograph was, where the photographer was standing, because the trees had died and they were cut out and there's a lot of changes. So we want, as part of the documentation, to be able to establish where the photographer was taking his pictures. The maps, obviously if you have a professional photographer, that means a professional surveyor, that would be great, but that's not a requirement. We're talking about sometimes thousands of dollars to survey. So what information you can get, and even getting out there with the steel tape and measuring it, at least we've documented it, and we're going to put it in the deed records with what information we do have. The archaeological data and remote sensing, that's really a site where we have no markers on top of the ground, and we need some documentation about the cemetery, and also documentation about the boundaries, because we definitely want to know. Don't want to leave part of the cemetery out, assuming that maybe there's just depressions in the ground. We certainly want to include the whole cemetery, and that's something that when we do this and provide this map to us, be sure to provide all the information. I've had cases where I'm reading the narrative and it talked about a single grave outside the fence, but it's not on the map, and it's like, well, we want to include that. We don't want to leave that out. And recently I got this beautiful surveyed map, and I called the applicant, actually the applicant's husband. She wasn't available, and he's a licensed surveyor, and he said, well, I got sort of roped into surveying this cemetery, and there's about 50 or 60 graves, so he marked them all and got this map and tied it in with the road. And there were 2 graves outside the cemetery that weren't included on the map. And I guess I saw the photographs, or I knew they were there, and I said, what about those 2 graves? And he said, Well, he said, I'm not from here. I married into the family. He said, I think they weren't Lutherans, and they didn't let them be buried. And they're like 1900. And so, I said, yes, we've got to. So I was in the area, so I went out and measured it and included it in the map. Because it's important. I don't know, there are other cases where there's unmarked graves, where there's indication that there is one. So we try to include that in the map. So this is the affidavit that's recorded, and when somebody buys the property to do a title search, I understand that title companies come into the county clerk's office and write down all the newest information that's provided, and then they index it by the abstract number and the original survey. So we want to include this into their data, so when they do title search, they know that there's a cemetery there. And I think 9 is where we are here now, isn't it? Right, Ken? So this is, and I didn't do the whole state. This is the number of designations that have been done in the neighboring counties. And I would say it's been a great improvement. I'd say 5 years ago there were a lot of ones, or in some cases none. So we're doing a great job. We still have a long ways to go, but we're moving toward that direction. And I did just want to mention 2 counties that have really been working on the designation, and I do. It's Houston County's here, and I certainly applaud them for working on the GPS and working toward the endangerment and working toward those designations, because that's really important. Lipscomb County, which is, does anybody know where Lipscomb County is? In the northeast corner of the Panhandle, and they only do have 9. Well, they say they're only able to find 9. And there may be others, but they wanted to go ahead and they designated all their 9, so I guess technically they're the first county to have designated all the cemeteries in their county. Navarro County, which is southeast of Dallas, they think they have about 140. And the county chair called me, Bill Young, he's an archaeological steward and the chair, called me one day about maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and said, what's this Historic Texas Cemetery Designation program? He loves to be sort of rough. And I explained it to him, he goes, And then he said, okay, and then he hung up, and then about 2 weeks later he called and said, well, we're going to do all ours. And I said, Bill, that sounds great. And I said, why don't you start with the endangered ones? And I kind of explained, and he goes, okay, that sounds good. And they've done 72, and they've found single graves, yellow fever victims, and they've really gone out there. He writes an article in the newspaper every week having to do with historic preservation, so that's been good because he's talked about cemeteries, or he had a name, didn't know where it was located, so that's helped him. And they've really done a great job. Unfortunately, he's had some health issues, so he's not able to get out anymore. So I think that number is probably going to be. It's a whole drawer full in our cabinet of files. But they did a great job, and at least a good start on that. He's got some money from the county to pay for the $25. But he's been able to set that aside, and I said, well, how do you pay for these? And he says, well, and he's been there all his life, so he knows other people. He'll do a cemetery, and he'll know that he'll see somebody that has a relative buried there, and he'll just go up to him in a restaurant and say, well, you owe me $25. And the guy will go, Bill, I don't owe you $25. What are you talking about? He said, well, I've done a cemetery, and you have a relative buried there. You owe me the $25 for the processing, and they generally give him the $25. So it's been kind of an interesting thing. So and then he's also gone out to some other counties and talked about his program to some of the neighboring counties too, to really kind of break through the ice that this can be done, and it's not as difficult as it may seem. This is an interesting one, but Sherwood Cemetery in Erie County, south of Tom Green County, San Angelo, and they still have a windmill on the property there with the cemetery. This is an interesting marker that's in San Antonio, and I think it's a child had died, and they encased the toy on the grave marker. So that ends my presentation. I guess I'll take any more questions while we set up the other.